Welcome everybody to Bronx Eats and tonight's special event with Shanae Nicole. It is exciting to see how many old timers and how many new people registered for this class. Clearly, Shanae's topic has sparked an interest in all of us, and we're thrilled to welcome you, Shanae, to the virtual Bronx. I met Shanae only a few months ago on a Zoom call that was completely unrelated to food, cooking, or the Bronx. And in the course of our brief conversation together, we realized our common interests, especially on the subject of food justice. It is my great privilege to introduce her tonight to this growing Bronx Eats community. On another note, I want to mention how inspired I am to have so many medical students from Einstein College of Medicine and Montefiore Medical Center with us here tonight. It gives every one of us hope to know that so many of our future Bronx doctors want to understand more about the powerful interplay between food, health, race, and US history. Thank you for being here. Before I introduce Shanae, I want to take a minute to give some current context to her talk tonight. As most of you already know, COVID caused massive economic stress in the Bronx. Food insecurity, healthy food access, and health disparities got much worse during this time, especially for Black and Latinx families. Access to high quality, affordable fresh fruits and vegetables has always been a challenge for low-income communities of color long before COVID hit, because of structural racism and inequities in the food system. This has increased diet-related chronic diseases and made COVID-19 cases more deadly and harder to escape. It has never been clearer that access to healthy, culturally appropriate, fresh food must be seen as a basic human right for everyone, especially in New York City, the very richest city on earth. Bronx Eats is one organization looking to change the food landscape so that access to fresh, affordable, and nourishing food is not limited by income, race, or neighborhood. Everyone depends on access to a healthy food environment to experience physical and mental health and to live up to their potential. The food system needs to work for everyone. Bronx Eats is here to make sure that Bronxites can purchase and know how to cook healthy, delicious, plant-based meals. We hope that you will join us for future classes. And now, as for Shanae, she has studied food justice issues extensively, and I believe that she is ready to create a shift in our collective consciousness. We all hold the ability to do just that, and we must. Shanae Nicole is an artist, a public speaker, creative consultant, writer, educator, and healer with over 11 years of experience as an account executive, web producer, media buyer, singer-songwriter, and composer. Originally from Houston, Texas, Shanae made her way to New York City in 2008 to pursue her dreams of becoming an ad executive and singer. Her life changed at the end of 2015 when her father unexpectedly passed away. This traumatic life event would be the catalyst that aligned Shanae to her true path of seeking justice, equality, and healing for both marginalized communities and Mother Earth. She left her corporate job at the end of 2016 to begin this new journey. Over the past 5 years, Shanae has dedicated herself to re-education, decolonial studies, social economic justice movements, and holistic health and healing. Most recently, she has received a second degree in Africana, Puerto Rican, and Latin Studies from Hunter College and started her own business under the name The Empathic Realist. Shanae's work is rooted in critically assessing our current social structures through a compassionate decolonial lens, allowing room for infinite possibilities of accountability, liberation, and healing across communities. A few housekeeping notes. We are recording the presentation. Shanae will be happy to answer your questions after her talk, so please type them into the chat box. Also, it really makes it more personal and connected if you can turn your video on, so please turn them on if possible. And without further ado, take it away, Shanae.
Thank you so much, Gail, for that amazing intro where you were talking about Bronx Eats and about what's happening in the Bronx. And thank you so much for the introduction. I'm so happy to be here with you all. It's such an honor. And before I share my screen, I just wanted to, again, thank all of you guys for being here. And I want to thank Gail, the founder of Bronx Eats, for graciously asking me to host this conversation today. And I just want to thank you for your generosity and trust in my work and message of decoloniality. As Gail was saying, when it comes to food justice, in particular in New York City and in the Bronx. We see this continuation of brutal systemic behavior from our governments and institutions, continuing to oppress various marginalized communities close to home and across the world, for personal and monetary gain. So, and we've seen this with no real call for actual repair or healing, only band-aids to issues that need major surgery and repair. So I want to dedicate tonight's conversation to my ancestors, including my 4 grandparents, my father, one of my mentors, Bill, and for all the unknown ancestors whom were viciously removed from their lands, cultures, families, histories, and spiritual practices, all for the greedy enhancement of white European colonial powers. And I also would like to acknowledge that the lands I'm currently on are the Germanos territories in Texas. So I'm gonna post a link here if you don't know the lands you currently are on, or if you would like to share them in the chat, I will put the link here. And I also want to preface that this conversation that we're going to all be engaging in tonight is only going to touch the surface of the historical origins, the implications, and the ongoing issues we continue to face as it pertains to the intersections between food, colonialism, and capitalism. And I also want to stress that it is my intention to present this information in the most compassionate and sincerest of ways with an abundance of respect, love, honor, acknowledgement, and appreciation towards the Indigenous, the African, the Indian, and marginalized communities on the inferior side of this conversation. There may be things tonight that are left out as a result of timing or not knowing the full extent of the impacts in certain areas across the globe. So I do want to apologize in advance. The work that I'm engaged in is ongoing, and I'm committed to learning about the violent impacts of colonialism and slavery in every crack across the world. So feel free throughout this conversation to leave comments in the chat this evening if there's other data or information about countries or communities not mentioned here that you'd like to share in our community here. And again, my goal with tonight's dialogue is to expose the core cracks that have led to the global colonization of our food systems. So with that said, because we're going to be diving deep into some heavy topics, if you want, I would like everybody to share their favorite music album or artist in the chat. And you may be wondering why I'm asking this. Like I said, because tonight's conversation is going to go deep and be heavy, and maybe heavy for some. After we have this virtual meetup, I would like you all to listen to your favorite album or artist as to move the heavy energy through your body. Dance it out, sing it out, stretch it out, whatever you need to do. The other powerful element of unlearning and decolonial process is moving our emotions and feelings through our body physically. It's in my opinion and from my doing this work. So whether it's some form of creative expression, dancing, singing, meditating, I know for me, whenever I'm engaged in this work or doing research, 2 of my favorite albums to listen to are Rhythm Nation and The Velvet Rope by Janet Jackson. It helps me to really move this heavy energy through my body. And it also allows me to connect with my ancestors and honor them for this work I'm doing to heal my lineages. So Gail, you can go ahead and share the screen. Thank you guys for that. And we'll get started. So tonight's conversation is going to, oh wait, that's your screen, Gail. You can just click the stop share. There we go. Okay. Oh, you have it disabled. Can you, I think you can click on my name and, do you see it? One second, guys, sorry, thanks.
You can also find it at the bottom of the screen where it says screen share, where the green arrow is. If you click next to there or click within that box, it'll ask you to give screen sharing permission.
Everyone can see my screen, right? Okay, awesome. All right, so let me just move this and we will get started. Okay, here we go. Just give it a second. Okay, everybody can see the screen, right? All right, So as Gail mentioned, I'm going to be speaking tonight about the intersections between food, colonialism, and capitalism. And I'm specifically going to be starting at the time of European invasion in the Americas, and later the continent of Africa and the country of India. And then later we'll talk about how we can become decolonial with our food, reconnecting us to the land and local communities. Yeah, here we go. So as Gail said, I'm originally from Houston, and this is just a little bit about me. Here, as she mentioned, I used to work in advertising and marketing, and I also was a professional singer. And after my dad's passing, that basically was sort of the catalyst for me aligning with where I truly, really wanted to be along my path. And so I've spent the last 8 years in community support and activism, primarily in New York City. And I've also traveled to over 12 countries, teaching, performing, and engaging in colonial research. And then it was in 2018 that I made this decision to go back to school to pursue a second degree, which Gail had also mentioned. And a year after that, I also began studying the powerful work of Dr. Vandana Shiva, whose focus is on saving the seed and unpacking colonialism through the lens of food, land, farmers, and climate sovereignty. Her work really opened my eyes to understand how our food systems are just as colonized as every other system that we are currently all forced to participate in. And I began to connect those dots on a personal level as someone who has suffered with food and environmental related chronic illnesses and diseases since I was a child. And it was that moment that I decided that I wanted to deeply investigate the connections between our food, colonialism, slavery, and how they all relate to our current system of capitalism. So my decolonial journey of re-education and learning came to be the foundation for my resistance against the systems in power in a form of acknowledgement and honor for the ancestors that came before me, whom were subjected to horrendous forms of violence and treated as commodities for white European colonial profit. And so in 2020, I started building a decolonial platform under the name of the Empathic Realist, as I wanted to create an alternative perspective for critiquing and discussing solutions for repair, accountability, liberation, and healing on both a local and global level. So tonight we're going to explore these intersections in 3 parts. First, I'm going to give a brief overview of food systems. Here we go. So we're going to do a little brief overview of pre-colonial food systems. Then we're going to briefly talk about the Atlantic slave trade, cash crops and food capitalism, how the two are connected. And then we'll end with how do we move from an economy of greed to an economy of care. And that's something that Dr. Vandana Shiva really stresses in her work, which I just admire it so much. And so I want to start off with the first question of asking everyone, is my plate of food a colonial subject? So you can give yourself a couple of minutes, or a minute just to think about it. And while we're kind of reflecting on it, we're also thinking ways about how our meal has been colonized or capitalized in any way. And when we're asking ourselves these questions, I know through my research and through my conversations, a lot of times the answer is yes, somehow, some way our foods are being colonized, somehow, some way they're being capitalized, and that, let alone how that connects to lack of access to food. And so one of the first quotes here is from Thomas Sankara, who was a Pan-Africanist and former president of Burkina Faso in West Africa, which was also a French colony. He states, if you want to find coloniality, just look at your plate of food. And South African chef and food entrepreneur Mokade Etswang, she says, you can't talk about food or trading without talking about colonialism. So we know that for decades, if not hundreds of years, Indigenous, African, Indian, and other marginalized communities have been fighting for their land, their seeds, and their basic human rights since the introduction of colonialism, slavery, and later imperialism. What many people may not realize, as our history books have been very manufactured to leave out these vital elements, is that white Europeans were not coming to save, quote unquote, you know, the African community, the indigenous communities, or the Indian communities. They very much were trying to find a way to eliminate trade with the middleman, which most times that was the trade with along the coast of Africa. And also because they were trying to also eliminate having to have linguistic translators as well, as they were trading incense, spices, silk, and other resources. So dozens of peasants in Spain and Portugal were vying for the top spot of finding this Garden of Eden through their explorative sailing endeavors. And so we'll dive into that in a bit. So let's just go to the next. So before 1492, there were a handful of trading routes that were primarily run off of various coasts of Africa, along the ports of India into mainland China and along the Mediterranean Sea. These routes connected the East and the West pre-discovery of the Americas. And author Alex Ives Bortolat says, African rulers and merchants had established trade links with the Mediterranean world, Western Asia, and the Indian Ocean region. Within the continent itself, local exchanges among adjacent peoples fit into a greater framework of long-range trade. And it's widely known that the continent of Africa, they had very lucrative economies for at least over 4,000 years. And some of their trade routes included multiple Trans-Saharan trade routes that connected Africa to the Mediterranean and the Middle East. And I have those charts right here. Yeah, as you can see in these two charts, these are the trade routes for Africa and for the coast of India there, as you can see. And so in the same regard, India was a well-established country with bustling ports for trade and very healthy agriculture. And we all know that one of their most famous trading routes being the spice routes, which that route itself was what instigated the Atlantic slave trade. I know when I went deep into my decolonial studies, that's something that I hadn't learned in my, primary school days. And it's really important to mention here in this conversation. And in particular, it was Spain and Portugal who were on that mission to find direct routes to the spice route as to avoid indirect trade and tax. So as I said, this information, it's important to debunk any of the theories as to why white European countries were trying to explore, a lot of it trying to around this whole thing of saving these different communities, and that just was not the case. And many historians also believe that in parts of Africa, their industrial capabilities were much more advanced than Europe prior to the Atlantic slave trade. And I also want to point out that while doing this research, it was really painful because a lot of this information was done through a white-bodied lens. Oftentimes these histories being told through a romanticized colonial and supremacist point of view, which we know is very problematic. But obviously there are BIPOC educators, historians, and scholars that are starting to recount these ancestral histories for full transparency, critical assessment, and accountability, which I think is so important, which is one of the reasons why I felt motivated to start doing this work, to tell my ancestor stories. And so now when we're talking about the food systems prior to 1492, when it comes to the continent of Africa, many of the countries had very diverse agricultural systems depending on the climate and location. But generally speaking, they had various time-saving harvesting techniques that allowed for easy labor. Their production was based on local needs of the community as well as trade. And a similar history can be said of India as well, with many parts of Southern Asia as well. And so there's a similar history between the two, especially because Africa and India were trading for thousands of years. And there are still pieces of their history that historians are trying to piece together. And it's my belief that it's because of colonialism, because of that massive disruption there's so many stories and histories when it comes to the seed, when it comes to the food, when it comes to the inner communities that have been just lost. And it's really unfortunate. But I also just want to highlight that Dr. Judith Carney at UCLA, she made it a point to highlight how Africa was a vital participant in the domestication of plants and animals in different parts of the world starting some 10,000 years ago. And some of their indigenous crops included African rice and eggplant, also watermelon, Guinea millet, sesame leaves, cotton, bitter tomato, oil palm, okra, coffee, and African cucumber bitter melon. And she also states that Africa was vital in the development of several Asian crops that arrived on the continent. And some of those crops include the Asian yam, ginger, plantain, and the banana. And some of those food crops had been domesticated on the continent starting about 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. And when it comes to India, according to the Journal of Ethnic Foods, some of the indigenous crops to India include several varieties of rices, including colored rice, aromatic rice, and medicinal rice varieties, such as millets, barley, and wheat. And research done by the International Center of Tropical Agriculture found that a few other indigenous crops to India included the jackfruit and mango, which had originally derived from Southern Asia. Also, sugarcane is really important for obvious reasons to intersect into this conversation, as it was such a profitable crop during the Atlantic slave trade. Sugarcane is believed to have originated in Southern Asia, in the Southern Asian part of New Guinea, making its way to India, where it first encountered organized production. So now I want to go to understanding the trade and food systems pre-colonization in the Americas. And with this understanding, I just want to say that something else I noticed during my colonial studies degree and outside of that, it was very difficult for me to find information on Native Indigenous trading and food systems, only because it was really difficult to find access to that information. So the information I have is all I have at this time, and I'm still trying to find ways to learning it through a decolonial lens. So when it comes to trade and food systems in the Americas, and this is North America, the Caribbean, South America, and Central America, the trade and food systems, they varied across geographic location and proximity to other tribal nations. And according to Zulin Cruz Diaz of the Community Food Lab, before Spanish colonization in the 1490s, Puerto Rico's Taino population led a relatively self-sufficient food system with some trade involving nearby Caribbean islands. In North America, which is also known as Turtle Island, archaeologists have found that indigenous peoples in most parts of North America traded among tribes, and these trade practices expanded over time. And it's also noted that when the Spanish did come to the various coasts of the Americas, they were very, quote unquote, impressed with how sophisticated their systems already were. And so another thing I wanted to point out when it comes to the native food systems, they prioritize food as a way to strengthen the health and robustness of the communities. And this is from Christina Gish-Hill. And she also states that the purpose of their food production was not profit in any way. And it was based on sustenance practices that were embedded in social organization, religious beliefs, and generations of experience with a particular landscape. And food was produced not only to feed the body, but to heal and strengthen it like medicine, to offer spiritual entities as a sign of respect, and ceremonies to bolster community cohesion through the generosity of feasting, and to trade as part of sustaining intertribal relations. And so some of their native crops include groundnuts, corn, beans, squash, huckleberries, persimmons, wild grapes, wild rice, and strawberries. And like much in India and native tribes across the Americas, they held beautiful celebration ceremonies that were centered around different food crops, honoring their harvests and agricultural seasons. And one really important thing last thing I wanted to mention on this part was about the ancient Three Sisters agricultural practice, which if you're into farming or composting, you may have heard of this practice. And it derives from Native America. And Christina says the Iroquois and the Cherokee called corn, bean, and squash the three sisters because they nurture each other like family when planted together. So this is everything having to pertain to pre-1492. And I think it's so important to highlight this because it gives us just a small insight into how prosperous, thriving, beautiful, and amazing all of these areas of the world were prior to white colonialism, European colonialism. Okay. Yeah, and this is just talking about the pre-colonial trade and food systems in North America. So this is one thing before we get on to, this is sort of the introduction into the Atlantic slave trade. So James Hancock, he says, to most medieval Europeans, the spices came from some sort of distant paradise, likely the Garden of Eden. Spices were thought to be in great abundance and would be easy to obtain if only they could find their source. This belief fueled the European age of discovery. It enticed, and I crossed out explorers and put colonizers like Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama, who was working for the Portuguese, to embark on their journeys. And I crossed out great journeys because we know that these are not great journeys. They were horrendous things but anyways, okay. So when da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, he burst into this vast existing trading network. The European powers were clueless about the depth, sophistication, and wealth of the Indian Ocean network. Again shows that these areas were not in need of saving in any way. They were very much thriving and bustling economically. And so now we're going to get into the meat of this, which is cotton, sugar, and spice, how and why our foods became colonized. So again, we're going to be doing just a brief overview of both of these sections. So there were 2 points of contacts. I mean, I think from my schooling, I only knew about the contact with Christopher Columbus, and it was said that he came to America, but when in fact he actually had came to the Caribbean. But then the other point of contact, which was across the Indian Ocean, which was by the Portuguese, which is what I mentioned with Vasco da Gama. So we have Christopher Columbus making contact in 1492 in Hispaniola, and then 1493 in Puerto Rico, and Portugal making contact in 1498 in India. And so basically the voyage by Christopher Columbus, we all know it ended up leading to the decimation of entire indigenous populations across the Caribbean, and ended up being the introduction to the Atlantic slave trade. So on the other side of the world, you had Vasco da Gama, whom was an explorer for the Portuguese. They already had relations with Africans as they were trading with them on the western coast of Africa. And they had also actually set up a prominent trading post in Ghana, which would later become holding cells for African slaves. However, their monarchy also wanted a direct route to the Indian Ocean trade as to take out the middleman, as I mentioned earlier, and they found it, unlike Christopher Columbus. And subsequently, the Portuguese, they forced their way onto trading posts off the eastern coast of Africa and off the coast of India. And this would later lead to other European powers fighting over colonial ownership. And around the same time, Spain and Portugal had also made a deal once the Spanish had discovered the Americas, where they wanted to basically divide it between the east and the western side. And it was called the Treaty of Tordesillas. And they obviously did this for trade and agricultural production. And so this is before the British or French got involved. Spain and Portugal had colonized parts of the Americas to produce many food crops, one of the main ones being sugarcane. And their other main goal was the mining of gold, which was very lucrative and allowed them to expand their colonial powers. And it's also important to mention here that Portugal was actually the first European power to partially colonize countries in Africa before 1492. So as you can see from this short explanation that doesn't even touch the surface of what was to come, it wasn't until much later that the British, Dutch, and French began participating in colonialism and slavery in the Americas. So as we can see right now, we have indigenous populations that are destroyed due to violence partaken by the Spanish and the Portuguese. And we're now beginning to see the inching of colonization of Africa once we see the British and the French and the Dutch come into the picture. So once they do, we begin to see this all-out war against marginalized communities and their precious lands and seas. And so here, this is just talking about how the Atlantic slave trade basically set the stage for disconnecting us from our homelands, from our cultures, and from our intimate connection to food and our relationship to the land. Okay, there we go. And so here we see, this is the Atlantic slave trade at its peak, which some of you may have seen this before. Every time I see it, it always just shocks me. And I mean, as you can look here, I'll keep it up for a couple of minutes. You can kind of see the various points of entry. You can see all of the different foods and other agriculture that is being traded along with African slaves across the different coasts. And we see from the ports of Southeast Asia, Indonesia, and India, all of these different spices. We see coffee, we see pepper. I mean, there are just so many different foods coming from there. And we see on the America side, timber, fish, tobacco, sugar, gold, everything. And so this is, in my opinion, and other historians and scholars have said it, this is the beginning of not only imperialism, but capitalism too. So this is just right here. And I want you guys to also pay attention to this. What they called during the Atlantic slave trade was the triangular trade. So we see that America and Africa are on the bottom, they're trading slaves. We see from Europe to Africa, there's manufacturers, and from America to Europe and back and forth are the raw materials and the manufacturers. Make a mental note of that triangular picture. And so what we begin to see now, at this point, Britain is very much in the picture of the slave trade, of this agricultural trade. And Britain's presence or part in the Atlantic slave trade, it actually exceeded all previous forms of white European colonialism. It was one of the most brutal and economically advanced forms of colonialism. And this explosion of the Atlantic slave trade is what introduced us to the term that some of you may know, which is called cash crops. And the cash crop industry, which we still have it around today, it's basically monoculture crops that are used for export trading. So they just pick a few crops to harvest, to plant, and that's what they use. And they just disregard any other type of farming or seeds or food that could be harvested. And during this time, they utilized this for export trading to European countries from the Americas. So, and anything that was not profitable in the eyes of the Europeans were disregarded. So this meant that any other indigenous crops that could not be commodified were no longer grown on a large scale. So again, we see that disconnection from the land. We see that disconnection from indigenous foods that probably are much more healthy for us than what we see commodified. And so the main cash crops during this time were sugarcane, tobacco, indigo, rice, and cotton. And eventually we'll begin to see white European powers create the first modern and official monopolies on trade, including companies such as the East India Company. And so they gained this monetary power due to their exploitation of people and land for profit. And I'm sure, I'll say that again, they gained this monetary power due to their exploitation of people and land for profit. That sounds familiar because in many ways we still see that today in capitalism. And so as you can see from this map, like I said here, massive explosions of food trade and slaves across the Atlantic seas. And it's actually noted by historians and researchers that it's estimated that by 1914, a majority of the world's countries had been colonized by Europe. And so this is just another map showing a similar trading happening at the same time. And so Joe Kabuthi, who is a policy analyst and writer and production editor at the Elephant, and he lives in Kenya, he says, we often talk about colonialism in one of two ways, as a civilizing mission or B, as a grand imperial project. Seldom, though, do we talk about the simple yet potent motivations behind coloniality. For instance, Britain's search for food was a major factor behind the imperial conquest. Subsequently, our food and coverage systems still show evident signs of coloniality in today's world. So now we get to the point where slavery becomes abolished. And again, I want to apologize that I'm having to kind of push through some of these details that are very vital due to timing. So the abolishment of slavery was less about the humanity movement for marginalized justice, and it was more about it not being needed anymore due to the Industrial Revolution. And so this brought the human form of commodification to an end for the time being. And so we go from food being colonized to food being imperialized. Europe's colonialist agenda ceased to exist while their imperialist agenda began. And so now they're in need of raw materials to build their machineries on the European home base. And they already knew where to get these materials, which was in many cases the continent of Africa. And so they then began to engage in the same pillaging that we saw during the colonial era. And so now it's being revived for economic and through the guise of economic and political disruption on the continent itself. And this only exacerbated Europe's desire to continue cash crop exports, as they had seen how lucrative they were. And so what they did to the Americas, they were now doing on the continent of Africa and in India. And so both areas were decimated economically and agriculturally due to the ongoing extractive and manipulative practices of Europe. And so this is just here a quote that just talks about how there we go. So when they colonized the continent of Africa, it was later known to be called the African Scramble. And I'll show a picture in a moment. And it basically just talks about how now that they decimated this other part of the world that they recently discovered, they still needed more resources. It's a profit and greed driven industry is what they got themselves into. And so all of these European countries here are who colonized parts of Africa. And here's a quote I think sums up what that was all about. And it says, the slave trade and slavery have by this time fulfilled their basic function of providing the primitive capital. The quest for investment of the accumulated capital and the need for raw materials led to the colonization of Africa. And so it's just basically that. And so what we then begin to see, then we go on to the colonization of India. And the primary colonizer was Britain, which many of us know, and some of its earliest player who they kind of dabbled with trying to find ways to colonize India were Portugal, the Netherlands, and France. And I think this quote is really important, especially when it comes to the economic aspect of this in relation to food. Thoreau provides us with a devastating portrait of how the British decimated the Indian economy through these centuries. In 1700, India was the world's richest country, accounting for 27% of the global GDP. But in 1947, when India achieved its independence, India had been reduced to one of the world's poorest countries with just over 3% of global GDP. And I mean, I think that just goes to show that, you know, this desire for, you know, profit at any means necessary, it just had devastating effects on those that were on the inferior side. And so also I wanted to, for those of you that may not know the difference between colonialism and imperialism, colonialism is the direct and overall domination of one country by another on the basis of state power being in the hands of a foreign power. And the definition of imperialism is the expansion of a nation's authority over other nations through the acquisition of land and or the imposition of economic and political domination. And so what we begin to see here is that after all of these years of communities being just decimated beyond reproach, you know, they're having to relinquish their land, their seeds, their cultures, their histories for imperialist and ancient colonial rule. And, it doesn't stop there, right? We all know this. And so even though they received, in many ways, these countries received independence to a certain extent, it also came at a terrible cost. A lot of these countries, it's particular across Africa and in India, these countries and in other parts of the Americas, the Caribbean and parts of South America, Central America, these countries became filled with famine, food insecurity, political unrest and instability, barren agriculture in many parts. And now what we're about to get into is how their seeds and lands became colonized via major corporations. So now we're going to go from, we're now entering into the 20th and 21st century into the ism of capitalism and how that economic system, and also I always like to say that capitalism, it loves to blame the victim for societal and institutional problems when it's the system itself that they can fix these problems if they wanted to. And so, oh, right. So I also had just posted a few pictures. They're not really triggering, but just in case they may be, it's just, I wanted to just highlight as we wrap up this section of the Atlantic slave trade and the imperialism of Africa and of India, and how the Europeans were justifying their colonizing and imperialism of these spaces and these places. So this is Manifest Destiny. Some of you may know her or this painting. It was basically, it was British, the British's justification through a religious lens of how they were sent by God to colonize the Americas, which we know that is just not the case, because they did much more damage than it was before. And so this was one of the ways they were justifying it with this manifest destiny. And so this is a famous portrait in the Americas. And then here on the left-hand side, we have the British Empire with the Queen, and at the bottom you see, which that's why I said the trigger warning, because it's not the most nice photo when we're talking about India. And this is just talking about the juxtaposition between the British monarchy and India. And I also want to stress that the British colonization of India, it brought about severe famine to that country. I mean, you can look into the history of it. It's just really horrendous. Just as here in this photo you see of Africa, this is where they got the phrase, the mad scramble for Africa, because this is all of the European nations vying for resources. And again, it's a horrible point in history, but it's so vital to understanding it, especially when it comes to our food, because all of this is as a result of trying to profit from the land. And so just to summarize here, just quickly, this is what colonialism really did. It disconnected communities from their energetic and physical connection and relationship to their land and seas. It destroyed ancestral stories, erasing ancient cultural histories that were connected to sustainable living and agriculture. It created severe disharmony between communities. And we can definitely see this in India and in parts of Africa, the continent of Africa, and across the Americas, how they just created so much disruption and disharmony that it became so difficult to find solutions. And so they transformed human beings and Mother Earth into economic commodities for extraction, labor, and trade. So this is just saying how now we're going into the era of capitalism. And so this is a really important chart. As we're digesting what we've just been talking about when it comes to the economic decline of the colonized places. If you see here in the at the top, all developing countries, and then if you look at South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa and you see the decline, these are two areas of the world that were bustling prior to 1492. And so we see, because of that and imperialism, that they just continue to decline. And I think it's just really, really sad. And that's why I make it a point of not just in my work, not just talking about the impacts in the United States or the Americas, but also the impacts on a global scale, because it's so vital to this conversation. And so now we see that land and beings, now we're becoming commodities when it comes to cash crop and monoculture industries, industrial agricultures, which is an extension of the cash crop industry. This being affected with global trade and then colonizing seeds. So both colonialism and imperialism, it birthed what we call extractive economies. And I want to thank Dr. Shiva for her and her team allowing me to use this chart here, because I think it's really perfect in talking about extractive economies and where we are now. Because as you can see on this chart, we have soil and the society at the bottom. And what's most important is the economy, and that's what's at the top. And so this is a consistent pattern that we're seeing globally. And of course, we're seeing this here at home as well. And so a big part of why this is continuing to go on is due to, as Dr. Shiva calls, the big 6 chemical and GMO corporations, because we go from countries colonizing lands, and now we're having corporations colonizing lands and seeds. And so as I was mentioning earlier, those 2 triangular comparisons of the Atlantic slave trade, and now we have the extractive economy. So we see that there has not been any change. Like, we're basically still in the same system of colonialism, and it's just now capitalism in many ways. And so as I was talking about with the big 6 corporations, Monsanto, which it actually just recently merged with Bayer, we see here this chart. I know we're running out of time, so I'm just gonna kind of push forward, but it's just important to highlight these companies because they're now the Christopher Columbuses. They're now the different countries that are going into different lands across the world to basically monetize seed ownership and monetize fertilizers and chemicals. And so Dr. Shiva, she talks about how basically we have 3 companies that are in control of 60% of the world's seeds and 70% of the chemicals and pesticides. And so how this connects to us, you know, especially us in the Americas, here in the United States, basically it's that the type of seeds produced are being dictated by these corporations. And so that dictates the type of foods we eat. And capitalism and the government are dictating this access to food that we eat, which is chosen by the big corporations. And so there's the open declaration by the Food Systems for People. They state that the industrial food systems and increased corporate control of food chains are responsible for existential threats faced by our populations and planet, including the climate crisis, deforestation, loss of biodiversity. And the corporate control has produced a food system that leaves over a billion people hungry, undernourished, and economically destitute. And the ultra-processed industrial products, also they're causing malnutrition, including overweight and obesity. And so now we're gonna kind of get into quickly discussing for us how this intersects with us in relation to food deserts. Okay. We got that already. Okay. And I just want to briefly mention here that there's so many amazing organizations and indigenous movements across the world that are doing incredible work in fighting these corporations, because now, again, like I said, we're not fighting per se countries, we're fighting corporations that are controlling the foods that we eat. And so we have, as you can see here, there are all these organizations. I'll take a minute if you want to screenshot it or take a picture to look them up on your own time. One thing I do want to point out is the farmers' protest in India. And some of you may have heard about it happening again last year and they were really protesting about agriculture reforms by the Modi administration. It's really important to understand these movements because there are people that are fighting on the ground for our access to food, our access to the types of foods we eat. So definitely check them out and support in any way you can, even if it's just sharing their message across your social media platforms. And so, like I said, now we talk about food deserts and food swamps, which equals human injustice. So as Gail was mentioning earlier about the Bronx is actually one of the top places that are experiencing the worst food deserts in the United States. Some of the other cities include Atlanta, Detroit, Michigan, Chicago, Illinois, San Francisco, Seattle, Camden, New Jersey, New Orleans, Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Memphis, Tennessee. And I find it so wild that as a country that ranks number 9 as wasting the most food, we have this issue of food deserts. And so I think that it's just unfathomable. And if you don't know the definition of a food desert, it's a geographic area where residents access to affordable, healthy food options, especially fruits and vegetables, fresh fruits and vegetables, is restricted or non-existent due to the absence of grocery stores within convenient travel locations. And a food swamp is an area where an abundance of fast food, junk food outlets, convenience stores, and liquor stores outnumbers healthy food options. And so we mostly see these areas in poor and low income neighborhoods. And it's both a systemic issue that's linked to high rates of diabetes, heart disease, and obesities. And many studies over the past decade have also stated that the communities that are most affected by these diseases are widespread across the African American and Native Indigenous communities in the United States in particular. And so again, it's just, we're experiencing these systematic issues. And while we may not be experiencing chattel slavery, I mean, there are just other ways that forms of slavery have transformed into the modern world. And so again, also another point something I wanted to point out is that there was also statistics that came out about how these issues exacerbated during COVID, both on a health level and economic access to food level. And so what we know now, a year and a half later, is while profits for corporations increased into billions, poor and working class communities, global economic losses were in the billions. And so one of these last slides I want to see here, this is the problem. And those corporations I was talking about, Monsanto, they own all the seeds, and those seeds get harvested and they create all of these abundance. A lot of them are empty calorie products. I know there's some stuff that we all love here, but just the important thing here is to know that these corporations, they are dictating what we eat. If we want to eat healthier, we may have to stop eating some of these foods. It's like when we're having these conversations around decoloniality and the such, we have to also be assessing what we're eating on a daily basis, and I just wanted to bring this in here because again, it's like another chart where we see major corporations that are in control of all of these different subsidiaries here. And then I just wanted to lastly highlight here on the other side of this, when it comes to the continent of Africa, other parts of the Americas and India, there's the global famine and underdevelopment issue, which is also human injustice. And so this is just a list that was updated in September of this year that is the top countries of food security and the top countries with food insecurity. And on the right-hand side with the food insecurity list, I also put the countries that colonized that country. And so obviously we see, I think one of the most devastating ones here is you see here Haiti, Mozambique, Burundi, which were all colonized by Europe to some extent, how they are at the bottom of the list. So they are suffering with the most food insecurity at this time. And again, it's just another effect of colonialism. And so this is just a chart showing again how the global food insecurity across the world. And again, we see places like Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast, Southern Asia, prosperous places pre-1492, and now they are some of the highest places of food insecurity. And so I wanted to end on this quote here with Dr. Vandana Shiva before I go into just some ways that we can go about healing. on a community level. And she says, every society is facing a crisis of democracy as big money hijacks the process of representative democracy, and elections are used to divide people through hate and fear. They divert the public consciousness from the real roots of their insecurity, thus preventing them from organizing and rising to protect the planet, to rebuild their societies, and to reclaim their economies and democracies. Again, it's all about building a movement so that we can reclaim our lands, reclaim our seeds, reclaim our communities. And so the last part here I'll just briefly talk about is, how do we go about cultivating sustainable economies and communities? And I love this image here because it's eco, not ego. And we know that colonialism was all started in many ways because of the ego. So we have to get away from that. All right, here we go. So how do we go about transforming our relationship to food and the land? I mean, for me, I know my personal journey, it was all about decolonial studies. It was all about connecting with Black and Indigenous communities locally to where I lived, and relearning the connection between the food that's grown, the soil, the seed, the harvest, it being coming to my plate, being digested, all of it being basically in ceremony. I've been talking lately to some of my friends about how kind of going back to that whole notion of eating as a form of ceremony. And I think that that's a really important way of how we can start transforming our relationship to the food and the land, and how everything is interconnected. Colonialism will have you believe that the earth, the plant, the soil is all dead matter for extractive purposes, and that's just not the case. And we all know this. And again, I want to thank Dr. Shiva for this chart here, where she is talking about one thing that we can do is finding ways to create circular economies. And so here you see that instead of the triangle, which is having the earth and the people at the bottom and the economy and profits at the top, we see that soil is at the top because soil is Mother Earth. And then we have the economy and the society. And so every single aspect of existence of the ecosystem is helping and interconnected with each other. And I think that's just such a vital thing to think about as we move forward. And so here, the other thing that I think is so important for us is to support Black, African, Indigenous, Indian, and people of color communities who are doing this work when it comes to food sovereignty and land sovereignty, research and support BIPOC initiatives in your area or in your country, and also communicate with these affected communities. I know that was something for me, especially during this decolonial journey, and over the last 5 years, I've been on the grounds and just communicating in any way I can. And over the last year and a half, I mean, I was even, a part of different clubhouse community conversations with Indigenous communities, with Black and African communities, just understanding what they need, how can I support, how can I share their information, and then learning their decolonial histories. And vital as well is to question and critique the colonial systems that are causing the harm. So often these solutions around food are being soundboarded by the corporations, by the governments that are causing the harm. And now it's time to listen to those that have been treated inferiorly and been treated marginally, because they are the ones that have the solutions to how we can create a sustainable world. And lastly, to connect with local farms, CSA programs, and composting. I know that when I was in New York City and in Astoria, they had the composting bins down the street once a week. And so I did that. And now that I'm back in Texas, I signed up for a composting program here, and I go and drop it off every week. And so they're just trying to find different programs that you can do, different ways to start reconnecting yourself with the land. I know for me, composting it's one small step, but it's just been so healing for me personally. It's just connecting myself again with the land and with the farmers and with the people that are doing all of this work. And it's been really amazing for me. And so also when I was in Brooklyn, I had participated in some CSA programs, which were really great. And so you can, Google that on your own time and see if you can find some of those in your area. And so here again, I know we're running over. Just a last thought here, we never really will know what could have been when it comes to many parts of the world because of colonialism and subsequent creation of capitalism and global trading systems that continue to oppress and violate marginalized and indigenous communities today. We'll never know what could have become of African, Asian, Indian, and indigenous societies prior to 1492. So key takeaways is begin the decolonial unlearning journey, engage in conversations across identity and economic lines, repair and reparations, which will equal restoration and healing. And my goal in continuing to have these conversations and doing this work is to have liberation for all beings, species, and Mother Earth. And with the great Audre Lorde, without community, there is no liberation. And I mean, Gail, I don't know if you want to do maybe 1 or 2 questions if anyone has. I have some extra time for Q&A, and then I'll just leave this up if we have time for Q&A if people want to reach out. And
Yeah,
again, I want to go ahead.
No, thank you so much. You can wrap it up? I think
Yeah, I'm good.
Yeah, I think that we can take maybe 1 question and then close it out just because we're running a little short on time. Thank you so much, Shanae, for your incredible wisdom and sharing so much new information for many and old information for some, and giving us a lot to chew over. And if there is 1 question, there is a question in the chat. Maybe we'll just end with that. What do you say to those who call this pattern of imperialism and destruction as Darwinism, survival of the fittest?
Yeah, I've heard that before. I mean, I think in some ways it's because we've been disconnected from the land. We've been disconnected from the spiritual aspect that connects us to how we interact with Mother Earth. And so from that perspective, from pre-1492 perspectives, everything is connected, and there is no, in my opinion, from my research, my studies, and I'm also spiritual, I study Buddhism and have for a very long time. I don't believe in the notion of survival of the fittest. I think that, as Dr. Shiva says there in the chat, there in the presentation that I just gave about circular economies, a circular economy doesn't there's no room for survival of the fittest. Everything is supporting each other. And so I think that's what I would have to say to that. Beautiful.
Well, thank you again, Shanae. I know that people here learned so much from you this evening, myself included. And there's such a growing awareness of how so many systems need to change. And I believe that you really raised so many important questions for us to consider. Relearning how to create sustainable economies and communities, eating as a form of ceremony. How can we make the necessary repair, accountability, and healing of our food system? How can we stop being extractive and profit-driven in the ways that you described? How can we create a circular economy with soil and Mother Earth at the top? All of these questions we will have to keep discussing and keep thinking about. I loved what you shared about food not being something for profit, but a kind of spiritual medicine and a chance to share stories and ceremony, and something that created cohesion in communities, and honoring the seasons and the metaphor of the corn, bean, and squash that work together. And that's why they're called the 3 sisters. They nurture each other like family. And I think that, from those examples, we really have to ask ourselves, how have we set society up in such a wrong way, right? What does our country stand for? And how has it come to be like this? How did we get here? What do people want and need moving forward? How can white people start to take accountability for the suffering that they've caused and continue to cause? How can we create an inclusive country? How can we motivate the dominant class to take accountability for the suffering of people of color? And how can white people see things truly as they are instead of defensively? How can we become decolonized with regard to food, reconnecting us to the land and our local communities, all of which you really raised so beautifully tonight. I would just add the similar question, how can we nourish more collaboration and cooperation?
Yes,
So much
that's the next step.
from your talk tonight. I really want to thank you for your time, but more importantly, for your fight for food justice and human rights. And I believe that with your continued leadership, we will continue to heal our food systems, ourselves, and the destructive legacy of colonial trauma. I pray that we find the courage to heal our past collectively, and I really cannot thank you enough. Lastly, please keep your eyes out for Bronx Eats Vegan Burger Series, which is coming up in early December. Thanks again, everybody, for coming. Please eat real food and stay safe until next time. Shanae, thanks again. It was really quite.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you, everyone that came and showed up tonight. Thank you, thank you, thank you. This will be one of many conversations to come because there are so many ways to unpack on so many different levels this information. And so thank you guys. And like Gail said, yes, let's eat real food. I'm all here for it.
All right. Until next time. Thanks for coming,
Bye,
everyone.
everyone. Peace
Bye.
and love.